it's so misunderstood as an illness. And I think for so long people have thought, as I did growing up, that it was sort of all about cleanliness or contamination fears, which it very much can be and is for a lot of people, but it's not just that.
Hello, I'm Dr Jodi Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about obsessive compulsive disorder, otherwise known as OCD. And I am so grateful to be interviewing and chatting and having a conversation today with the wonderful Penny Moodie. Penny co-founded with her friend Rosie soocd.com.au, and we're going to talk all about that as an amazing resource for you and also a gateway to lots of help and support and resources and how to find extra help as well. So I came to your work when I listened to an interview that you did with Mia Friedman for the No Filter podcast. And I highly recommend listeners, once you finish this episode, of course, jump onto Mia Friedman's No Filter and have a listen. You'll learn more about Penny's experiences. But some of the things that Penny shared on that podcast really helped me to understand my own OCD that I've struggled with a lot in my younger years as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, much of which I didn't really understand because the people around me who were supporting me didn't have a good understanding around. And it really just struck a chord with me how open you were, Penny, about your experiences and how passionate you are about helping people to understand OCD. So perhaps that's a really good place to start. Can you help our listeners understand what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely try. It's quite a complicated mental illness, I guess, like all mental illnesses. But at its core, I guess it's, when people experience, as you would expect, obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions basically are a fear that you might have, and they often come in the form of an intrusive thought. And then the compulsions are basically how you deal with that fear. And they can be so many different things, but basically they could be overt sort of physical compulsions, or they could be mental compulsions, which you sort of play out in your head, which obviously you can't really, from the outside, you can't really see. So at a very basic level, that's what OCD is. And it's all about trying to remove doubt, I guess, from your head, or remove uncertainty. That's what causes, I think, a lot of the fear with OCD is uncertainty and not really being able to be okay with uncertainty.
Yes, it's at the heart of anxiety, and though OCD used to fall in the what we call the diagnostic Bible of mental illness, it used to fall under anxiety,
Yeah,
exactly, but now it's in a category all of its own,
yeah.
and that uncertainty is just such a huge driver. Could you give us an example of something that's caused obsessive, or what perhaps obsessive thoughts? Because I know it changes as well, that it's not always about the same thing, but could you give our listeners an example of an obsessive thought and what sort of
Yeah.
a compulsion that you or someone that you have connected with before has experienced, to sort of give a bit more insight into what the experience of it is like?
Yeah, definitely. Because it's so, it's so misunderstood as an illness. And I think for so long people have thought, as I did growing up, that it was sort of all about cleanliness or contamination fears, which it very much can be and is for a lot of people, but it's not just that. So another example that people may not think about, something that I went through a little bit in my 20s was, I can't remember what sort of subcategory it falls under, if it's harm OCD. I can't really remember, but it's the fear of, I often had this fear that when I was driving that I had hit something or someone, whether that be like an animal or a person. If I just sort of went over, a bump or something and it felt like I'd hit something, I would then start to really worry about that, and all these sort of worst case scenarios would go through my head. And the compulsion in that case, I guess, was turning around, going back, checking that I hadn't actually hit anyone. There wasn't a body lying there or anything, and doing that a number of times because I would think, oh, I would check, but then I'd think, oh no, maybe that wasn't the spot, and I'd have to try a different spot. But another compulsion would also be, for some people in that case, might be avoiding driving altogether because they just
Mm.
don't want that, that fear to come in. And it's so time consuming as well, especially if you're on your way to work or something. And it didn't help because one day I was driving in the car with my ex boyfriend, and he did hit a puppy actually. And it was awful. And anyways, that was like fear actually playing out. But that's something that would happen to me quite a lot when I was driving, and I think more in the earlier years of when I sort of had my license. So that's just one example, I guess, of an obsession and then a compulsion. There are so many others I could give, but that's one that I think usually you would do it by yourself, like, so
Mm.
people wouldn't see that. They might just see that you're always late, but that's something that's really awful and really, like I said, very time consuming as well.
Yes, thank you for sharing that that has been an experience of yours in the past, and I think it's probably worth pointing out too that with that idea that if you've gone over, when the tree root raises the asphalt, or there's a stick, or it could be anything, and that when your brain starts to send you these thoughts that you've killed an animal, if you've run over a person, you've caused harm, because of
Mhm.
course we do know that OCD often goes very much against our core values, doesn't it? Our core values and beliefs, and
Yeah.
who you are as a person, and
Yes.
then that wave of anxiety and that distress and that sense of panic, and
Yeah.
then to have to go back and to relieve that, all of those sort of sensations and thoughts, to look for the dead animal or the evidence
Mhm.
against or for or against, so that you can at least get that
No.
certainty.
Yes.
And checking was something that you mentioned, and
Mm.
I look back in my family, and my mum has shared with me that her dad, he was a what you would think would be sort of the fairly classic understanding of OCD some time ago, where he would check the light switches all the time, but he would flick them. He
Yes.
would flick them.
Yeah.
And I grew up with a mum who would always go back to check if she'd turn off the iron.
Oh, my mum's the same, but not only
Yeah.
the iron, but the oven constantly. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Do you remember as a little girl being off in the car and having to turn around, and how did the rest of the family sort of respond to these compulsions?
Yeah.
Which yeah.
Well, in my mum's case, she worked at the Children's Hospital for a while, and she was on the burns ward, and that made her very afraid of going to bed, leaving anything switched on.
Yes.
She would sort of go through a bit of a ritual before bed of switching everything off. And I certainly don't blame her for this because, I mean, I very much have OCD anyway, but it's something I very much do now. And it drives Hugh crazy. I know it does because I'm standing there at the oven every night, just staring at it, like just staring at it for a while, like just trying to really picture the fact that like the dial's on zero.
Yeah.
Not
So
giving it
really
a glance, but really getting, like it's almost like a photo in my mind. And actually, I know a couple of women who have OCD who, with the whole checking thing, which is kind of, how a lot of people see OCD, but it takes up so much time and it's so distressing to them that they would often have to, or they do often have to take photos of like their hair straightener being off, for example,
yes.
to remind themselves when they've left the room that it is off. But of course, again, like logic never prevails in OCD, and there'll be still some doubt that creeps in. And I don't think that ever really works for a long time. But that is interesting about your mum as well, because it's just little thoughts like that can just cause so much distress.
So much distress. And I love that you touch on the fact that the rational, logical perspective just doesn't come into it.
Right.
You shared that you would stare at the oven, and we can take an action like turning off the iron, or because I'm medicated for my anxiety, and it's really quelled the OCD in an extraordinary way, which I'm grateful for, even though my philosophy and my passion is about helping people understand that you can have challenges and we can still move forward.
Mm.
It's good to understand them, but I would say out loud, the iron is off, and I would unplug it, and I would have to sort of, and that was a strategy that started to help. Switching the switch wasn't enough,
Yeah.
and I've now been able to drop the verbal out loud expression of what I've just done, and I can just turn it off and unplug it. And like you say, just try to concentrate,
Yeah.
because I think the autopilot way that we can live our lives, we can often, all those times we went back in the car, the iron was always off, the oven was always off, the hair straightener, it's always off. We do it, but we've got to be really mindful and
Mm.
present. And you shared earlier about, so we're talking about some of the noticeable physical compulsions. And could you share a few more ways that people, that the compulsions to sort of settle that uncertainty and that anxious overwhelm? Can you share with us a few more of the ways people do that that's obvious, and also some of the ways that it's not obvious, the mental compulsions?
Yeah, definitely. Checking lights, like we're just talking about, checking power plugs, that can be very noticeable, even though a lot of people will often do it in private. So a lot of people won't generally know. Something that's sort of categorized, I guess, as magical thinking OCD, which is like an example of that was when I was little and I was really worried that my parents would die in a car crash if they went out, unless I would do a little ritual of things. So it was like knocking on wood and was like saying a few different things. And it was just had absolutely no connection to my parents. It made no difference really. Like now I, think about it. But this kind of OCD is really very common. If I do this, it will stop this terrible thing from happening.
Mm.
And they're often physical things. But again, a lot of people won't ever notice their loved one doing it because they'll often do it in private. And I would do it sort of at bedtime, I think. And my brother, I was sharing a room with my brother, and I'm sure he noticed, but he was like, "What is going on? What is going on with my little sister?" But it's not really questioned when you're so young, I guess. And I guess another kind of more common one would be washing your hands or
Mhm.
sanitizing your hands. And obviously with COVID, I mean, this contamination OCD will be going through the roof, which is really devastating. But constantly needing to be clean of germs or dirt or all sorts of different things. So that's quite a physical compulsion. Some examples of more mental compulsions. The obvious one I can think of is just ruminating. So
Mm.
maybe you are worried that you've said the wrong thing, or that you've done the wrong thing in a social situation and you're really embarrassed about it, and you're worried about how other people will perceive you. And so you might, in that example, play a certain scene over and over and over in your head, trying to convince yourself maybe that you didn't make a fool of yourself or you didn't do anything wrong, and trying to get certainty just by thinking, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and I realised that one of the things that may not be common knowledge about OCD is the idea that it can look like there isn't a compulsion. With some people, there aren't necessarily
Mm.
compulsions
Mhm.
in this true sense of the word. But one of the things that I've seen and done is
Mhm.
that reassurance seeking,
Yes.
and that
I don't know
looking for
whether
that.
to classify that as physical or
Yes,
that
yes,
is kind of
that's it.
physical, but it's often not seen to be a compulsion. Yeah.
Yes, you're right. And it's just too distressing and too painful to not get the certainty around the situation. And what you're really hoping for, anyone who's struggling, is the certainty that everything's
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
You want to go back and see that there isn't a body
Yeah.
of a possum on the road, or
Yeah.
an injured person sitting on the gutter. But equally, if you did find that, which is so unlikely, because it's a thought, it's not a fact,
Yeah.
then at least you close the loop, so to speak. But the thoughts can be just so terribly distressing, and it's something that I've talked about. I'm really working hard to help people understand more about the way they think and to be able to observe their thinking. And what would you share with people who were struggling with OCD or are caring for someone who are experiencing OCD? How would you talk to them about the idea of these intrusive thoughts so that people can have a better understanding about the link between thoughts and facts?
Yeah, it's a really big one. One of the best books I've read about OCD is by a guy called Jonathan Grayson. I have to check this, but I think it's called Overcoming Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. Um, and he talks a lot about the fact that certainty is only ever a feeling. Like you can actually not ever be certain about anything. We can't even be certain that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. We don't know. We can feel certain that it will because it has, every day of our lives. But we can never actually use, like I said before, you can never use logic to try to change a feeling.
Mm,
So I think it's all about trying to become comfortable with uncertainty, which seems very counterintuitive at the start because I feel like I spent my whole life trying to run away from, well, achieve certainty, and then to be told you absolutely never will, and you have to be okay with that. That seems to be a very sort of proven way to kind of deal with OCD. And something that's really positive with OCD is that it is probably one of the most distressing mental illnesses, but at the same time, I think it's something like 70% of people will respond really well to exposure and response prevention treatment. I mean, it's not the only treatment, but it's proven to be really, really successful. So I think, in this book I was just talking about, I think Jonathan Grayson talks a lot about trying to understand it. The more you understand it, the sort of further you'll be in your recovery. And also, I think something to remind yourself if you do experience OCD is that fact that all these thoughts, like you said before, Jodie, are so counter to our values, our core values.
mm,
And I think some people call that ego dystonic thoughts. They're very much in conflict with what we truly believe. So
mm,
trying to keep that in mind is really, I think, can be really helpful because you've got to separate the thought from yourself because it's just, and I think that's something I took a long time to learn. But once it was pointed out to me, my psychologist was just like, you have a thought and then you see the action and you put them together straight away. And you've got to try to separate what they call thought action fusion. Like
mm.
it's just something that's learnt, but trying to separate a thought and an action straight away can be really powerful. It seems so obvious to some people, but it never did to me.
Oh, well, I think on sort of I say the other side in that you've learned so much and you've got so much insight and knowledge and expertise, lived experience and also so much that you've learned and read and through your own therapy. But it's hindsight's 2020, isn't it? I think when you're in the middle of it, it's just so overwhelming. And
Yeah.
when you're so swept away, and I use this metaphor that it's kind of like getting swept down a river by your thinking. You're so lost in the thought that you've got no control over thinking that, and when we're highly anxious, the rational thinking, problem solving part of our brain's not available to us. We kind of need somebody else's brain to to support us in that time. But the idea that to even build the skills to be able to get out of the river and sort of stand on the bank and watch it all go past and recognize that we have so many thoughts. I mean, scientists have put it at 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day, and a lot of people will have weird thoughts, thoughts that are kind of quirky or a bit confusing. And people who don't have OCD can kind of go, "Oh, that was a bit weird," or not even really consciously kind of even acknowledge it, and it just kind of goes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I recall as a kid, I was very much step on a crack and you break your mother's back. I believe that to my core and would
Gosh.
be distressed if I wasn't able to. accomplish that on the way home from school on the pavement. And I remember, and I haven't shared this on the podcast, and for some reason I started having a really intrusive thought that I was going to stab my parents with a fork. Very random, very strange.
Yeah.
Great parents, like happy home.
Yeah.
No reason for, even to this day, I sort of think, wow, that was just a random thought, but my brain just latched onto that, and that was just such a distress, and I just have to see a fork or,
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
be reminded. I told someone once and she said, "Why a fork?" And I'm like, "Beats me." I don't know. Um, and but it you feel so worried, and you're like, "What does this say about me? I must be just the most horrible person." And
It's
it's
the opposite
so
of that though, isn't it? It's because you find it so distressing. It's like that's the last thing in the world you would want to do, which is why it causes you so much distress.
yes. One of the things I researched in Anxious Mums, and I was reading about it on your beautiful website, is the idea that having the thought doesn't make you any more likely to actually go through with the action, and that mothers who have intrusive thoughts about their infants, because OCD, the risk of OCD just skyrockets in that
Yeah.
perinatal period, doesn't it? And that you can have a thought, I'm going to throw my baby out the window, or how can I make this baby stop screaming, and have intrusive thoughts, but it's very distressing to have them, but you're not actually ever going to do that. That's more likely than the average person to
No.
harm or follow through, but it just can make you feel, yeah, pretty rotten.
Yeah. It's a really worrying thing, I think. I don't know what the research is around it, but I just know, like, in terms of numbers and if it's going up or not with sort of postnatal, women in that postnatal period. But I just know of a lot of women who've been through that, and women who might not have experienced OCD before having kids, but then having kids, being absolutely exhausted and having these thoughts, and then they turn into these loops. And when you're sleep deprived and your hormones are going all over the place, it can be a very awful experience and a very isolating experience if you don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And I worry there's not enough support out there for mums who are going through this. And also just not enough awareness, because a lot of people, like you say, will have the thought and then think, well, this makes me a terrible mum, and completely irresponsible, when really it's just, we all, like you say, we all have these thoughts, and we all kind of have to have these thoughts sometimes. I think the brain, you know much more about this than I do, Jody, but I think you have to play through certain scenarios in your head. It's just human nature, but it's just latching onto certain ones, which can be really distressing. And then often mums or dads going through this won't know what it is, and won't then seek help. So, because they're too worried to share these thoughts with anyone else because they think other people might judge them.
It does, and if my memory serves me, which it doesn't always, I recall something in the order of 135% increased likelihood of obsessive and compulsive thoughts and behaviors of OCD in the period after birth,
Wow.
for a period of time.
Wow.
And I think what you've just said, I agree with you wholeheartedly. There's so much shame.
Yeah.
There's so much shame, and from what I've learned through Brené Brown's work, that the idea of shame is that if I share this, I'm going to be excluded, I'm going to be on the outside,
Mm,
and that's what can really mean that people are suffering
mm,
alone.
mm,
And you're in no state when you've got little ones to necessarily have the reserves or the resources or even the time and space to be able to kind of get a good view on what you're going through. And
no.
I guess that's a good thing for us to sort of touch on, in that it'll mean that it's the people around them that
Yes.
will hopefully be able to observe behaviours. I remember it's fascinating, Penny, and I again, I'm just so thankful to have a conversation with you and be able to share more light on this for people. And I'll just that conversation you had with Mia, the things that you shared just got me because I could reflect on where it had played a big role in my life, but there was so many experiences of OCD that I never attributed to that.
Mm.
Uh, it's funny, while I'm talking to you, I'm looking at this place where I used to breastfeed, and sorry, fellas, I know that there are lots of fellas that I our son had a tongue tie and I had to use nipple shields. So there you have it. There's a little bit of insight you weren't expecting.
That's
And
what you
and
wanted to do, yep.
yeah, um,
If
and
breastfeeding isn't hard enough. Yep.
yeah, exactly,
Mm.
exactly. And the contamination around the cleanliness of everything I needed was just off the charts.
Mm.
And we didn't see it at the time. We were too far in, and Peter wouldn't have known what to look for. And so I think what you're doing, the work you're doing, and along with Rosie's, is
Mm.
so important because it is around 2% of the
Mhm.
population, but it can start really young.
Mm.
And I was looking at the research, and I think there's from what I've been reading recently, there's two main times in life where it typically there's an onset, and it's a little bit earlier for boys, around 9.5 years of age, average onset for boys, 11 for girls. But
Okay.
then there's another bracket in the early 20s.
Yeah.
And what was your experience? When do you first recall experiencing OCD? Or when can you look back and reflect that you were
Mhm.
experiencing OCD?
It's almost hard for me to remember a time when I wasn't experiencing symptoms now that I look back. I mean, I think I can kind of pin it to about 6 or 7, probably 6, is when certain intrusive thoughts would come into my head and cause a lot of distress. Or even something, and I think I might have talked about this on the other podcast, but it was like I couldn't really get through reading a book like very easily because I would read something which was setting the scene, a kid's book like the Babysitter's Club or something, and it would set the
Mm,
scene, and I would have to imagine it so perfectly in my mind. And if I couldn't picture everyone and everything in its place, what I thought it should be, I'd have to start again and start again and start again. I'd never really
mm,
get through a book. So I remember things like that from a really young age, and then at some point it shifted into that whole fear of getting AIDS, and then that stuck around for probably about 2 years. And then it would shift again, and it kept shifting. The actual what the fear kept changing.
yes.
It was from then, yeah. And I wasn't diagnosed properly until I was about 31. And I knew I had it when I was about 26. I knew it was OCD because I read an article, a very, very honest article by an anonymous person. They didn't want to put their name to it, which is totally understandable because it was very,
Mm,
very, they didn't hold back at all. But it was like a revelation to me because I was like, oh, this is what I've been through my whole life. And no psychologist has been able to tell me. And to be fair, a lot of the time I wasn't being totally honest with what was going on in my head because I was worried, that I would be judged for it. But that's when I think that was one of the most therapeutic things to have ever happened to me, is reading someone else's experience and then handing it to my dad. I remember my mum was overseas. I was living at home. I was going back home for a few months, and I gave it to my dad, and I was like, this is what I've been through. And it was really eye opening for him and for my mum when she read it as well. So I think knowing that you're not alone in it is just huge for someone with OCD because you can feel so alone
mm,
in the whole experience. I have heard, and I don't know if this is right or not, or if the research keeps changing, but I have heard that oftentimes you might be born with like the genetics of OCD, but it might not be triggered until certain times in your life. So I just remember reading that somewhere. So I'm not to say it's all genetic, but I think that's one theory.
yes, and there's definitely I don't know the stats on OCD particularly, but with anxiety, which is related because it's that anxiety is really what you feel, isn't it, when you have the intrusive or
Yes.
obsessive thought, that it's 30 to 50% of cases of anxiety is hereditary.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like you say, we can have the gene for it, but it needs to be triggered
Mm.
by the environment. And so it's not necessarily going to be an issue for every family, the offspring in every family, but
No.
there's that sort of increased likelihood. And when it comes to OCD, some of the things, when it comes to kids, one
Mm.
of the things that I was thinking about before when we were talking about some examples was the idea of when you were talking about the ritual,
Mm.
in that some children, and they'll grow into adults, and I'm sure adults, fall into this as well. But I guess my area of work
Mm.
sees me talking to a lot of parents about their own challenges, and that some children will have a ritual that it starts here and it ends there. And if there's an interruption or if it's not
Mm.
done right, if it doesn't feel right,
Mm.
it'll start again. And that can see
Mm.
some children taking 4 hours to actually finally put their head on the pillow and
Mm.
go to sleep. And some kids are just constantly seeking reassurance. And
Yeah.
it's very distressing for the person experiencing it, but also very, very hard on the family and on the there's
Absolutely.
usually one parent, isn't there? It's usually one parent who
Yeah.
tends to be the go-to the primary carer in the eyes of the child.
Mm.
Um, you mentioned before about exposure and response prevention, and I wanted to come back to that because I'd love you to share a little bit more about the fact that this applies in OCD not only to the intrusive thoughts, so it's exposure to something that provokes the uncertainty, and it's that response prevention through coping,
Yeah.
but then it also applies to the compulsion, doesn't it? Because you've not only got the intrusive thought, which you've got to learn to manage, but then you've got to avoid doing the compulsion. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, exposure therapy, I guess, will be used for phobias. That's how I always saw it, is like, a fear of you do a fear of flying course if you were scared of flying, or you do this course at the zoo. I remember there's like holding spiders if you were scared of spiders. So I always saw it in that context. And then when I learned that they use it for OCD, I was really surprised and initially very scared. I was like, well, if I want to get better, it seems like I will have to do this. I don't want to do this. This is facing your fear head on. And it's not, I'd spent so long doing kind of your standard CBT, which and I wasn't getting anywhere with it. And I know some people do. And I think a mixture of exposure and response therapy and CBT can be really good. But I was just doing cognitive behavioral therapy, wasn't really getting anywhere. And so I thought I have to do it. And yeah, for me, I guess it basically involved creating a hierarchy of fears. So you would always do it with a very experienced therapist. And basically, the idea is that they take you from, your lowest fear, I guess, or a fear that might provoke a response that might be like 50% or something, and then work your way up. And the whole idea is, like you say, you're trying to trigger yourself, I guess, into having a fear response, and then sitting with it and not performing the compulsion, which is
Mm,
so difficult, but it can be done. And the whole idea is that at the start, you will get very anxious. You probably will be panicked,
mm,
and this is why you've got to do it, and initially you might do it with the therapist in the room. Your heart rate will go up, you might start sweating, you might, you have this real fear, might be sort of like a fight or flight response. But after doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it, the idea is that that fear will get less and less and less, to the point where you
mm,
get triggered, and you might still have an anxious response, but you can sit with it and not play out whatever compulsion it is. Because I've read
yeah,
that compulsions are sort of similar to using thought suppression. It doesn't work with OCD. The more you play out a compulsion, the more you're going to have to do it, in future.
mm,
So that's been my experience with exposure and response prevention, and it's not an easy thing to do. I don't think anyone would say that it's easy or pleasant, but it can be very, very successful.
it's something that is more accessible now for some with the introduction of virtual reality ERP.
Yeah.
Have you
No,
Yeah,
I've read about it. I don't know anyone who's done it,
yeah.
though, but that's fascinating to me.
So it's amazing to see, despite the impact of technology on the population's mental health as a whole, which is a topic for another day, that it's really amazing to see that for people who have a fear of heights or
Mm,
flying, that, like you say, you can step through. So it's that hierarchy of, well, what's the least anxiety provoking thing I can do that'll challenge me, like you say, at a low level. And then once you've repeat, 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 then you take the next step. And
mm,
some people get very creative. I know a mum who had a child who struggled with separation anxiety.
mm,
And so what she did for her daughter was so creative. I don't know that I could have come up with this, but as she was sort of came up with the hierarchy with the psychologist, she got to the point where, because when it's separation anxiety, they're kind of with you or they're not.
yeah,
And so you can't be
completely.
half there. And
Yeah.
um, what she did as she was building up to a sleepover was, and this took a lot of trust, and there was so much trust and conversation around it. But eventually, her little girl could go to a trusted friend's house, have a fun play, have dinner, watch a movie, eat popcorn, whatever, go to bed and go to sleep, knowing that mum would come and pick her up.
Mm,
So fall asleep somewhere,
mm,
but know that mum was coming, because she couldn't have just fallen asleep and had a sleepover and gone through the night. But she
mm.
built her up with this
Yeah,
hierarchy of step by step, and it took
yeah,
quite a long time, and sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, it can feel like.
yes.
But it there's and I guess one of the things that you've said that's just so important, I think, for all of us, whether people listening are listening because you have your own struggles or because you're supporting somebody who does. But Dr. Renee Keisha put it beautifully, just when we feel like we're getting a sense of control, life has a way of showing us that, sorry. Um, and so I think that idea that if we can accept that life has lots of ups and downs, and there are times when we feel at ease and content and excited or hopeful and optimistic. And in the same day, you can feel worried and anxious and fearful and disappointed, and that allowing all feelings to come and go. And as you've said with OCD, just really being able to accept the uncertainty and that discomfort
Mm,
and not have to wait to feel comfortable to
mm.
be able to get on with life, because otherwise it just costs way too much, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It costs so much time, and it's something I wish I had learnt at a much younger age, and it was impossible. And I think, like you mentioned earlier on, Jodie, like it was impossible because no one around me knew what was going on, for so many different reasons, but mainly because there's just absolutely no awareness of what OCD is, or was at the time. And I think like it just makes me think of whenever I went on holidays with my family, that's when it would really peak because that's when I'd want everything to be perfect.
Mm,
And if things didn't seem perfect, then it was like everything had come crashing down. So I think learning from a young age that you can have all these different thoughts and you can sometimes feel a little bit unsafe or a little bit anxious or uncomfortable or whatever, and it's all part of the experience is so it's a hard thing to learn, especially for kids. But I think trying to get that message through at a young age is really important, that your head can be tangled and it can be messy and you don't have to work everything out.
mm,
I think that's a really big thing. And I really do feel for parents who are going through this experience with kids who have OCD or who they think might have OCD, because as a parent, more than anything, I'm sure you want to provide that certainty for your kid. I know my mum did, when I was constantly going to her for reassurance. And you want to take away all that distress and all that pain. And so you often will try to provide reassurance for them, or you will do whatever it takes for them to kind of play out their compulsion sometimes, I imagine. And I think one of the hardest things as a parent must be trying to walk your kids through, the lesson of being comfortable with uncertainty and actually being witness to them feeling that discomfort, I think, would be torture for a parent. It must be torture. But I think as long as you've got someone, I think the main thing is, obviously having someone who can walk you through it as well, having a really experienced psychologist or therapist, whatever it might be, would make all the difference. But I really do feel for parents in that instance because it can't be easy.
Oh my goodness, you've really nailed it, and that's I spend a lot of time chatting to parents and learning about the different experiences that parents are having in their families with their children with mostly anxiety, sometimes it's OCD, sometimes it's depression, other times it's ADHD and that this idea that we want to fix things, that there's this innate drive in us, we want to fix it. And
Mm.
I went to my mum for the reassurance, and even when I was
Mm.
in my early 20s and I was
Yeah.
teaching,
Yeah.
and I would ring at recess sometimes to say, "This happened," because I just couldn't stand the discomfort of the uncertainty and the worry.
Mm.
And I think one of the greatest gifts that we can do, and I'm a parent of a 13 and 11-year-old, I may not have mentioned to you, and I know you've got a 5 and a 2-year-old, and lots of parents are listening as well, that one of the greatest gifts I think is that this idea that we can show, instead of feeling the need to fix things and make it better, it's about really demonstrating through our own behaviors that life has ups and downs and sharing how we cope and how we handle it.
Mm.
And I've talked before about coping out loud,
Mm.
and I have a blackboard that I keep in our family room, and I'm always writing just a little something. Sometimes it's a quote, sometimes it's just a little message. And at the moment, it says something along the lines of, "What didn't go the way you expected today? Question mark. What did you do about it? Question mark."
Yeah.
And that's a prompt for
Love that.
Pete and I to also share with the kids, so that it just becomes part of the vernacular of a family, is that when things go wrong, not what could I have done to stop it or how can I fix it, but, well, it's difficult for me, but this is what I'm doing about it. This is how I'm coping.
Mm.
And if kids can go through their childhoods and then sort of leave the family nest with this idea that I feel equipped.
Mm.
Whatever life throws at me, I can do it. I've seen my parents do it.
Mm.
My parents haven't been able to dodge all those curveballs life throws. Our kids won't. Some kids will until they're a bit older. Other kids will unfortunately have a few curveballs of their own when they're young.
Mm.
But it's hard, and it's often our own distress as parents, isn't it? That we've got to sit with our own distress and be a safe, calming, comfortable, trusted person they can sit with in their own distress.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that is they're words that are easy to say,
Oh,
but
so
their
hard.
actions are hard to do.
So hard to do. My God.
Oh my
Really trying
oh,
to
I know.
trying to
Oh,
learn that
goodness.
at the moment. But I think it's such an important point, like you to help your kid who might have, OCD or anxiety. Obviously, you want to be a really safe place for them to open up and to feel like they can come to you with anything, no matter how crazy the thoughts might be. But it's then, learning ways to, like you say, not take the pain away and not necessarily provide reassurance that they're so desperately wanting, which can be so hard, but still being that place that they can come to so that they can at least get it off their chest and you can listen and you can be there and you can be a very safe place. So I think that's a really important point.
It's very hard, isn't it? Sometimes if I know that one of the kids has a need, well, I know they need to talk to me about something, and I can see the distress,
Mm.
I have this monologue in my head as I'm walking to their bedroom, neutral face, neutral face, neutral face, because I'm such an open book, and I think, "Don't react, don't react, don't react," because you don't want them to read, even though you feel it, we need to be, like you say, we need to be that. And it doesn't mean to say we can't then we it's important we deal with our own feelings about what's
Mm.
happening at another time with our
Mm.
partner, a friend, or a therapist. But,
Yeah.
as Meg Durham said in another conversation, she said, "It wasn't in the brochure. It just wasn't in the brochure, this
None of it
parent."
is.
None of it is.
I also find that with just in a marriage as well, doesn't have to be a marriage, any sort of partnership. With Hugh, with my husband, I'm terrible like with that. Like if he's usually the calm one, but if he's not calm and he comes to me in distress with something, my immediate response is like, well, I sort of get up to the same level of anxiety and then I try to solve the problem for him to take it away. And it doesn't do anything. It doesn't help him. I'm not actually fulfilling any need that he has. I think in that moment, and this is the same as kids, they'll come to you and they just want to be heard and they just want empathy, I guess.
It's exactly what we'd want in return, isn't it? That idea that, and it is very, very hard when you got that tendency for your emotional temperature to rise pretty
Mm,
quickly.
mm,
And then you start having thoughts about, well, what does this mean? And what's going to happen? And what's next? All those what if questions.
mm.
And so having a good sort of mindfulness strategy or even a bit of a heads up can sometimes help in that I say that, but then someone says, oh, I need to have a chat with you later. You're like, tell me now.
Yeah, can't
Don't
wait.
make me wait.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Oh, Penny, look, I'd really love for you to be able to talk about the website, but just before that, one final quick question. How are you doing these days? How are you now?
Um, I'm pretty good. I do quite regular sessions with my psychologist. So for about the last 3 years, I've probably been seeing her every couple of weeks. And at the start, it was much more regular, but it's sort of now maybe once every 3 weeks or something. And that's sort of on top of being on medication, just like you, Jody. So I find mixture of therapy and medication for me has been really useful and really positive. And I think generally, because I understand the OCD so much better now, I'm so much more equipped to deal with it when things get difficult. So I think for so long, I wanted to believe that I would get to a point and it would end. The OCD would be
Mhm.
gone. And it took me a long time to realize that that's probably not the case, and it's something I think I've always had and something I probably always will have. But that thought doesn't scare me as much now. It's really about managing it. And there were times, especially during the lockdowns last year, where I found it really difficult, and I kind of dipped a lot, and I
Mm.
regressed, I guess. In those times, at least, I would know what to do. I knew that I had to go and see my psychologist. And I also had to do things like try and do some exercise or take the dog for a walk or just do something outside because that would help me. So much better at managing it. And I think there really is so much hope for people who do have OCD because it can be tackled and then it can be managed really well. And I've met people who have like medication resistant OCD, which is really, really tough because I think
Mm.
for me, and like you were saying, Jody, as well, like it's really, really, really helped me.
Mm.
I think that can be really difficult. So there are certainly lots of challenges for people who do have OCD and for their loved ones, but also definitely a lot of reasons to be optimistic as well that you can find help.
Yes, and one of those ways is through the website that you and Rosie have created. Can
Yeah.
you tell us, to finish up, can you tell us about that? And if people want to connect with you or the website, how they can go about doing that? Tell us about the website first and then how people can connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So a friend of mine, Rosie, and we went to school together actually, and we sort of hadn't seen each other for quite a few years and then kind of reconnected a couple of years ago. And we're talking about the fact that it was something that we'd both been through, and also talked about the fact that we both found it really difficult to find, I guess, resources that would help us. So, not only resources kind of explaining what OCD is and how it can be treated, but also where to find help within Australia. That was really, really difficult for both of us. We decided to create that resource, I guess.
Mm.
and we wanted it to be a really like a one-stop shop for people. So somewhere they could go to get the information they needed, whether they were suffering from OCD or whether they had a loved one who was suffering from OCD, to understand more about the illness and learn more about how it can be treated as well. So yeah, so it's www.soocd.com.au. And I think one of the things we really wanted to focus on was where to get help. I mean, that seemed to be the stumbling block for so many people, is like, yes, we know that there is treatment for OCD, but how can I get it? And especially in this COVID time when so many psychologists just have, well, don't even have waiting lists open.
Mm.
So I hope that part of our website is useful. We also link to another site on there. I might need you to put it in the notes or
I
something.
will. I'll put in the show notes. Yeah.
Called, but a fantastic psychologist in New South Wales has put it together, and it's basically you type in your postcode and then it'll come up with a whole lot of therapists. And they're still working on it, so there might not be a whole lot in Victoria at the moment, but I know he's building on it. So we link to that website as well. And I think for us, we just wanted it to be a really non-judgmental space, and to also to sometimes find the humor in OCD. I think that's been really key for me, especially in group therapy, has been like
Mm.
laughing about it because it can be so absurd. So we just wanted
Yes.
it to be like, not a really serious clinical site. We wanted it to be, an interesting place people could go and find more information. So I really hope that it's useful for people. And we do have a contact page as well. So if anyone wants to get in contact, they can always send us an email too.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, thank you. And I've so enjoyed, and it's not the first time I've been. As soon as I learned about the website, I spent some time looking and learning and reading, and it's so relatable. And it's a place where you can go as someone who's experienced OCD and feel understood. It's written, it's very clear, it's written by people who actually genuinely get it. And you've done a brilliant, beautiful job of it. It's not only interesting and trusted and got great insights and lots of beautiful information and resources, but it's a really lovely place to be. It's just the
Well,
design and everything is a really nice place to visit. So I encourage people listening to have a look. And I just love to add that what Penny was saying before about getting help, that there is a reason to be optimistic, because when it comes to these challenges, we live in a time where things are very different. You and I, Penny, obviously grew up.
mm,
I'm predicting I'm a bit older than you are, but I'm predicting, that the resources were pretty thin on the ground. Even if someone did understand it when you were young, when I was young, nobody got it. It was 31 when you were diagnosed. It took 20 years from 4 to 24 for my anxiety to be diagnosed. Not, and I'd had OCD throughout that. Plus, I ended up clinically depressed. But
mm,
when I got diagnosed and told, "This is what you have depression," the relief was
mm,
palpable, because it's like, "Oh my gosh, that must mean people understand this thing that
mm,
I felt so alone in."
mm.
And when they say, "This is what's happening, I can see it. I can see this is what you've been experiencing, and this is where you can go and start to get help." And so it is hard to go through these things as humans and as families and as parents, but the sooner you're able to recognize it and seek the help and get the help and get on that road, you'll be amazed at the inroads that you can make. So,
Yeah, and you
um,
can also, just on that point, you can also feel so vulnerable when you're stepping into the health system, I think, especially when you're not in a good place. And for so many people, like help doesn't seem accessible because it is so expensive. And there are, more of the mental health, the sessions you can get now on your mental health plan. But you can feel, yeah, like I said, very vulnerable, and there'll be a lot of GPs even who might see people who still don't quite understand OCD. So you might not be diagnosed straight away, and if you can, not everyone has the privilege of doing this, but if you can, I would certainly recommend trying to get second or third or fourth, opinions, because it won't always be picked up, and it rarely is picked up straight away. So, but you're right, we are at least living in a time when it's more, I think there's much more discussion and much more openness, and that's a really positive thing.
very much so. And you sharing your story really helped me learn more about myself. And I thank you again for joining us today here for the podcast, because again, you sharing your experiences, your insights, and everything that you've learned. Again, the ripple effect of, the people listening and understanding what's happening in their own lives or in the lives of friends or family, it's infinite. So you're doing amazing work, and you're doing brilliantly to share what you've been through, what you're continuing to go through, and how you're handling it in just such an accessible way.
Oh,
So
thank you.
thank you, Penny, so much once again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr Jodi Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.